Well, hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I'm doing 10 more mini album reviews. These were filmed a few days ago, so I had more hair back then. I got a haircut just recently since then. Right now it's November 13th as I'm filming this. Hopefully I'll have this video out today, but we'll see. At some point I'll get this video posted. And yeah, as always, everything here is just my personal opinion on these albums. None of this is intended to, if I say anything negative, it's not intended to be mean or anything. I'm just some guy sharing his opinions on the music he's been listening to. Anyway, let's get the review started with. So I'll admit, I do think that I was overly high on Porridge Radio's 2022 album at the time, which I put on my top 50 albums of that year. And looking back at it, look, I really don't agree with 18-year-old Simon on a lot of that list, including that album. And honestly, I don't even know if I ever really loved that album. Rather, I convinced myself I did to try and find enough albums for the list. And don't get me wrong, I do like that album going back to it recently. The frustration in the lyrics really did shine through in the performances, and there were some moments where it really resonated for me. But again, as a full album, it didn't completely click, and it just felt like something was missing. But here's their new album. It's their fourth studio album, and I wasn't really sure what to expect. And now, after giving it a few listens, well, on the one hand, I feel like this is kind of a little bit more of the same. But on the other hand, where I can at least recognize the moments from their 2022 album where I felt like I got it a little more, this album just really doesn't feel nearly as much up my alley. And maybe part of it is just wishing the guitars had less distortion on them to really give this more atmosphere. But that was also an issue for me on the previous album. But I also don't always like the mixing on this album, with one example being Lavender Raspberries, where the drums are buried under the guitar and keyboards, and the vocals just sound out of place in the production on that track. And also, it's hard to explain, but I don't really find Dana Margolin's vocals nearly as captivating on this album than the previous one. Don't get me wrong, she's not a bad singer, and I'm not here to tell you how much emotion is in this album because I honestly don't know, but the emotion just doesn't shine through as much here as on their previous album, at least to me. And I often don't find the songwriting to be all that interesting or memorable compositionally, where a lot of it just feels like it blends in with so much other music. And there are a few moments which feel specifically influenced by someone else, like the apparent Black Country New Road influence on Sleep Talker, where unfortunately they just can't capture that same magic. And no, I'm not saying I have any problem with taking influence from other artists. Everyone does that. I take influence from other reviewers. But a lot of this just feels like it doesn't really do much that interests me all that much that would really make me want to go back to it instead of listen to the other artists that I hear the influences from. So, when it comes to the lyrics, there's once again a lot going on, and I'm not entirely sure that I'm supposed to fully understand it. I mean, once again, there's a sense of frustration here in the album's sound, and in points I think it's noticeable in the lyrics too. But as I would have expected, the lyrics are quite cryptic at points, and there are also some more straightforward moments, such as the lovelorn god of everything else, and the comfort found in a dream of, in a dream I'm a painting. And I'm sorry, it's just not resonating for me nearly as much. I don't know, it's a tricky album to discuss for me because I can sort of see the appeal of it, but at the same time, I sort of feel like there are just plenty of indie rock records out there that I personally like a lot more. And I also don't fully get this album, where I can sort of see how, for a certain audience, the frustration of it might shine through more. And for me, the frustration is more due to the fact that I personally just don't find the album all that captivating. So yeah, overall, I can clearly hear the effort that Porridge Radio put into this album, especially in moments like In a Dream I'm a Painting, where the production sounds really high quality and almost gives me slight Wolf Alice vibes. I don't know if you can see my shirt that I'm wearing, the Wolf Alice Blue Weekend. Anyway, that was not intentional. I just realized that as I said that. But the lack of strong vocal melodies and some production nitpicks really just contribute to this album not really clicking for me, especially when the lyrics just don't really resonate for me personally. So, for me, this album is a 6 out of 10. But I would recommend this to fans of indie rock because you might like this a lot more than me. So, this is the first album The Cure have released since 2008's 413 Dream. And over the past couple of weeks, I've finally been going through all of their albums multiple times each, and some of those albums I definitely want to explore more, because a decent portion of them are great, some of them incredible. And as someone who's definitely becoming a big fan of The Cure, I was definitely excited about this new album, especially when I saw how much acclaim it's been getting. Usually these kinds of comeback albums don't get nearly as much acclaim as this one has been. It might be one of the most critically acclaimed albums of the year, probably The Cure's most critically acclaimed album since Disintegration. So, with all that being said, does this live up to the hype? Well, I'm not going to make a lot of fans here, but look, I really thought I was going to like this a lot more. but while I can respect the lyrics full of fear and emotion, which seem to be coming from a very real place, sonically there's just not really a lot to this as far as I can tell, and it's just not resonating for me. And a big part of this is the production, which sounds a lot messier than I would have liked, where a lot of the higher frequencies really distract from the atmosphere that a lot of these songs were aiming for. I mean, look at a song like War Song, which has a really odd guitar effect that I don't think works at all. And Alone, the opening track, sounds more like a demo than anything, and unfortunately I could not get past those issues. And again, it's not that I think this album completely sucks. I do like the desire for certainty of And Nothing Is Forever, a song which actually has some pretty nice texture with the booming drums and the melancholic strings. And I did think the closing track was pretty good, but overall, I personally just didn't really take much away from this record that really makes me want to go back to it. Yeah, this review is a little rushed, but this album just didn't give me a whole lot to say, especially when there aren't really a lot of strong hooks here. I don't think I can really go higher than a 5 out of 10. Considering the amount of acclaim this got, I was really expecting to like it a lot more, but I don't know. I gotta be honest here, this just did not click for me at all. So, I've always thought of VOLA as being one of those bands who are quite well known to die-hard fans of hard rock and metal, but who have always felt a little bit obscure outside of that. But I didn't actually realize until recently how much critical acclaim they'd gotten, especially for their first two albums. And unfortunately, after finally listening to those albums, I can't say I'm fully aboard the hype train. I definitely liked Applause of a Distant Crowd quite a bit, mostly because it showed a more melodic side of the band, but In Mazes really didn't do much for me, and especially following 2021's Witness and seeing this album getting what seems to be less acclaim than I would have expected. Well, I can't say my expectations for this were high, but when I first started listening to this album, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised by the opening track, Cannibal, which has a really good guest verse from Anders Frieden of In Flames. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. But yeah, the chugging riffs here actually have some real impact, unlike so many moments from Witness, where it just felt to me like style over substance. And while I do wish the overall sound of this track was a bit less foggy, there are moments where that kind of works, such as to go along with the synthesizers in the bridge. And yeah, the fade out at the end is a little too sudden, but look, nitpicks aside, more importantly, this song actually has a strong melodic hook, which I think elevates this to be among my favorite VOLA songs to date, along with Ghosts. And on the one hand, the rest of the album does not live up to the opener at all, but on the other hand, I think I feel fairly confident saying that every song on this album is good, at least from what I remember of it. And look, a lot of these songs aren't really all that memorable to me. I do think it shows VOLA going back to focusing more on melody, which is one thing that I really liked about their second album. And yeah, their first and third albums, I didn't really feel like had as much of that. The melodies weren't as strong. It wasn't as much about the melodies as the atmosphere and the vibe. And honestly, I think they don't fully sacrifice that vibe here either. I think this might be their best album to date, or at the very least tied. And look, I also mostly like the lyrics, which seem to be about acknowledging your own flaws and trying to navigate what to do with them, even though it doesn't feel particularly revolutionary. So yeah, overall, I quite like this album, certainly more than I expected. And while I wish the choruses really hit harder, there are still a lot of good melodies, and it shows potential for the band going forward. I don't think I can go higher than a 7 out of 10 on this album, but I am really curious to hear whatever they do next. This has got me intrigued. So this is my first time listening to a Devin Townsend album. I really just didn't feel like going through his entire discography, considering how many other large discographies I've been going through in preparation for reviewing new albums, and there's only so much time, and he has a lot of albums. Now, this album does seem to be getting mostly positive reviews, which I was expecting considering it's Devin Townsend, but it's not among his most acclaimed albums, and as someone who's never really listened to Devin Townsend before, I'm not even sure I'd heard a song of his, I had no idea what to expect from this. And it's got this sort of blend of alternative metal with maybe some djent elements and electronic elements that I would have totally eaten up when I was a teenager. Reminiscent of quite a few different acts whom I've listened to. I was reminded a little bit of VOLA in certain points. Actually, this album made me remember that VOLA existed, and then I looked them up and found out they had a new album, so that's where I found out about their new album. And I was reminded a little bit of Muse as well. Now, Devin Townsend has been releasing albums for longer than those bands, so maybe they took influence from him, I'm not sure. But either way, I don't know if it was just nostalgia for that sound that had me sort of won over on this at first, but it was around my third or fourth listen that I came to a certain realization. I don't think this album is very good. And a big part of this is the production, where the electronic elements lead to a more artificial sound, which I don't think really fits with the lyrical content of breaking free from your demons and appreciating your time on Earth. And yeah, electronic elements can work on an album like this, but it almost feels borderline robotic at points, such as in the video game soundtrack-esque Glacier. But really, my issues with the production have more to do with the mixing and the overall sound quality, where a lot of these songs feel completely washed out by certain elements, and the dynamics are a total mess. And going back to the topic of the lyrics, well, I just don't really find them all that captivating, personally. Yeah, there are some nice sentiments, and the sort of catharsis that Devin seems to be aiming for on this album can be really powerful, but the music itself doesn't make up for the lyrical content, mostly feeling pretty surface level and not all that unique. And look, it's not that there aren't some redeeming moments here. Probably the most obvious standout to me in a positive way was Gratitude, where the vocals really helped the melodic hook pop off a bit more. And also, Younger Lover has some of the better production on this record and some decent instrumental melodies, and I did like some of the guitar work on the title track and Ubelia. But then you get a song like Falling Apart, which just feels like it's trying to convince you of how epic it is, and it just doesn't have a lot of impact for me. And Jainism is probably the track where the probable Muse influence is the most notable. And unfortunately, I really don't like the vocal effect on that track, as it just sounds like a song that's trying way too hard. But then there's the closing track, Ruby Quaker, which I could not believe what I had heard when I listened to it, and I just feel like it's completely unnecessary and is easily the worst track here, partially because of the campfire vibes of the first verse, and partially because of the messy production, but mostly because of the chorus. Coffee, coffee, I love the coffee, 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 I love my coffee. It's a weird track. I will admit the very brief black metal section on this track was surprisingly good, but outside of that, it's a weird track. I did find it kind of funny, though. At the end of this, kind of gent metal, alternative metal album, we suddenly get a genre blending campfire song slash black metal song with indie rock and all sorts of different genres about coffee, a song about coffee and how much he loves coffee. I don't know, it's a strange one, but look, unfortunately I wasn't all that impressed by this new album overall. I guess I sort of get the hype, mostly because I was totally the audience for this when I was a teenager, but I was left feeling pretty underwhelmed by this album overall. I don't really think I can go higher than a 5 out of 10, to be honest. I honestly think this is kind of a mess. But if any of this sounds appealing to you, it very well may be worth a shot. It's just not at all for me. This is the 5th studio album by Kelsea Ballerini, and even as someone who likes country music, I can't really say I loved her first 4 albums after giving them a few listens each recently. But there were some good songs here and there, and I think I felt a little more positive than negative overall. And I was still a little curious to hear this album, even though I wasn't expecting it to be amazing. I mean, I didn't even mention she put out one of my favorite songs of 2023 on her EP that year, even though I didn't love the EP as a whole. Anyway, I gave this album a few listens as well, and it doesn't really give me a whole lot to say. I like the variety of the lyrics in this album, although for the most part I don't find them super deep, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially in country pop. But I think the country elements of this album are sacrificed in favor of a lot more emphasis on the pop elements, which I wouldn't mind if the production didn't make it feel so artificial, which doesn't really fit with a lot of the lyrical themes. And I especially find the vocal production holds this back for me, where the emotion of the singing doesn't shine through because it sounds so processed in a weird way which doesn't clash well with the instrumentals. Yeah, there are some moments that kind of seem more like straight up country music on the surface, but the more you listen to it, the more you realize it's kind of more of a pop album, and again, I don't think Kelsea does a great job of pulling that off. And look, there are moments that I like here. 2 things, it's a little closer to home than I would like to admit, even though the song suffers from the percussion not really fitting as much as I would have liked, which unfortunately I can say about most of this album. And the chorus of Deep is one of the few moments where I actually really like the vocal production. And I think the hand claps sound really good on I Would You, which also has some pretty strong melodies. But unfortunately, this album as a whole really feels like it could have cut out a good 15 minutes or so, and I think it would have been better in terms of the album's quality. I don't think it's a bad album, but it is one of Kelsea's weaker records in my opinion, so I'll give it a 5.5 out of 10. This is the 4th studio album by Soccer Mommy, the follow-up to her 2022 album, Sometimes Forever. Now, I recently revisited that album and listened to her first 2 albums as well, and while her first album was incredibly mediocre if you ask me, I think she showed a lot of improvement on her next 2 albums, especially Sometimes Forever, which did have a few weird moments that didn't really work for me, but also had the gorgeous rocker Don't Ask Me, and most notably the bone-chilling Darkness Forever. And now that I've listened to Shoo Shoo's discography, I can't help but wonder if Soccer Mommy was listening to them when she wrote that song. But yeah, I think she's gotten better with each album so far, and thus I was excited to hear this. And I don't think it's her worst, but I don't think it's her best either, and it lacks the same strong moments that made Sometimes Forever a really good album in my opinion. I mean, there are some moments that pick up the pace of this record a bit more, such as Driver, which has some sick guitar distortion. The shiny synths on Abigail were a nice touch, even though I wish they weren't so buried. And I also like the melodic hook with the guitar on Salt and Wound. But unfortunately, a lot of the music on this record just felt really bland to me sonically, without a lot of catchy melodies or memorable hooks. And I get that that's not necessarily what this album was aiming for, but I'm also not a huge fan of the production on this album, where it often sounds overly airy. I mean, look at a song like Changes, where the instruments clash in a really weird way that leaves this sounding overly drab and boring. And the overly stiff snare of Thinking of You really didn't work for me at all. And while Some Sunny Day has an interesting guitar melody which sounds like it was trying to capture the magic of 90s Radiohead, I unfortunately don't really think it works without a lot else to really make this song stand out. And while Sophia is a good singer, I don't really find her vocals here as impressive as on Sometimes Forever. Yeah, I like that she clearly expresses a lot of emotion here, but I think about a song like Don't Ask Me from her 2022 album, and I don't think any of these vocal performances are as phenomenal as on that track. And especially with the reverb that's been added to her vocals on some of these songs, it just really doesn't feel as raw as it could have. And I do like some of the lyrical sentiments, I will say that, such as the bleakness and the realization that everything must come to an end on the song Changes, and the slight sense of a feeling like time has stopped on Dreaming of Falling, one of the more mysterious tracks here, which I really like lyrically. And Anchor was an interesting moment as well, where she thinks about things she wished she'd done differently in the past, and the sense of being haunted by those memories is really striking here, even though I don't really find the melodies on that track all that interesting. So look, I don't think Evergreen is a bad album, just more a forgettable one, at least to me. I can sort of see the appeal of this, and thus I'll give it a light 6 out of 10, but I just wish it stuck with me a little bit more. I mentioned a specific style of music, which I don't really know how to describe in my review of Clairo's new album a few weeks ago. It's kind of indie folk, something like that. But yeah, this album just kind of falls into that category, and it's not really resonating for me as much as some other records in this vein. So look, while I think this is decent, and for the right audience it might be really good, I can't say I'm fully aboard the hype train. This is the second studio album from this American singer-songwriter who gained a lot of critical acclaim back in 2018 for her debut album, I Need to Start a Garden. And I'd never heard of her until this album came out, or at least not that I could remember. Now, before checking out this record, I decided to give that album a few listens all the way through, and unfortunately it's the kind of folk music that just isn't really for me. Mostly because I didn't find the vocal melodies all that interesting, and I also can't pretend I was totally wowed by the vocals or the lyrics, but I can see the appeal of it. It just didn't really click for me personally, that's all. Anyway, 6 years later, this album seems to be getting a lot of critical acclaim as well, although I wasn't feeling too optimistic considering my lack of enthusiasm toward the first album. And once again, I'm unfortunately not super wowed by this, but I do think I like it at least a little bit more than I Need to Start a Garden, and there are some moments that I think show a decent amount of potential. I really like the strings that fit really well with the production on the title track, and the clean acoustic guitar timbre of Redwood's Anxious God was really nice. And I also want to mention the tension and build of the opening track, which might be my favorite song here. But I still don't really find the vocal melodies here all that interesting, and while if I'm trying to be as objective as possible, I do think Haley is a really good singer, I'm personally just not really captivated by her vocals, and I'd just rather be listening to that Wise Blood album from 2022 instead. The poetry here is still nice, but it's just not really resonating for me as much as I'd like, and the album is just too underwhelming for me overall to give this a higher rating than a 6.5. But just like with her debut, I can appreciate this album more than I personally like it, so I'd recommend it to fans of folk music. It's just not really for me. It might click more for you, though. Alright everyone, it's time for me to get cancelled, because it's time to talk about my opinions on Tyler the Creator. Because look, after recently listening to all of his albums, some of which I'd heard before, some of which I hadn't, I can't say I'm a particularly big fan of his music. And part of this is that I think his first two albums kinda suck. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean all that hateful bullshit that he spat on those albums, or at least I hope he wasn't being serious. But I had such a hard time listening to albums like Bastard and Goblin, especially the former, which sucked. And while his next two albums were more tolerable, I still did not enjoy either of those records at all. Seriously, I highly recommend you just stay away from his first four albums. They're not worth it, in my opinion. However, with that being said, ever since then, it's felt like Tyler has become a completely new artist, especially with 2017's Flower Boy, which had a lot of lyrical depth and great production, and is a legit great album in my opinion, even though I still don't love it as much as most critics do. But then there's 2019's Igor. Look, so some of you, if you watch my videos, you may be familiar with the YouTuber Spectrum Pulse if you watch a lot of YouTube music reviews. One of my favorite music reviewers, and he gave Igor a 6 out of 10 and has it's kind of been an infamous review of his. And look, I hate when another YouTuber's infamous review because of a controversial opinion is one that I actually agree with. I love being able to jokingly make fun of reviews like that, but I would also say to me, Igor is probably a 6 out of 10. And yeah, I really could not really get into that album. I tried to give it a chance, but it just felt really surface level. The story going on throughout, just I wasn't totally captivated by it. I didn't find the production all that great. Maybe I'm missing something. Like there were moments that I liked. I actually really liked Playboy Cardi's guest verse in Earthquake. And there were other moments that I liked. Maybe I'm missing something. You can tell me if I'm completely missing something with that album, but I just really couldn't get into it. And then 2021's Call Me If You Get Lost does have some bangers on it, and I especially really loved the track Wilshire. And look, I like that album more than Igor, easily. But I didn't quite love it, and I still think Flower Boy is his best album up to this point. But I was once again hearing really good things about this new Tyler the Creator album, his new surprise album, Chromacopia. And I wanted to go into it with an open mind. I wasn't really sure what to expect. I didn't really expect to love it. But you know what? I will start by saying that I do really like a lot of what's going on here lyrically. There are multiple themes which continue throughout the album, one being trying to navigate what to do with your life and whether or not you want kids, and whether or not you want to commit to just one partner. And there are some really thoughtful moments, such as Hey Jane, where he gives this long speech, sort of letter about accidentally impregnating someone, and while it's directed toward the person he impregnated, and parts of it can't really be read a different way, there are parts of it which almost feel like an internal monologue. And then there's the next verse from the perspective of his partner, and the respect that they both show each other is really heartwarming. And I especially like how Tyler proposes the idea that babies taking the mother's name should become the norm due to the toll that pregnancy takes on women. And there's a lot of fear on this album too, and understandably so, which really makes the listener think about what it must be like to be a celebrity as famous as Tyler, especially a black celebrity who has also been a very controversial figure in pop culture. And while I obviously can't relate, I also think that's often the point. I mean, look at a song like Noid, where he goes into some pretty terrifying detail about precautions that he's taking due to the fear of being harmed and hoping no one will find out where he lives, and it's really powerful. And I also really like the plot twist on Judge Judy, in where, after spending most of the song talking about having sex with a woman, with quite a bit of detail, we find out later that she knew she didn't have long to live, and the narrator didn't know that. And her outlook on life and pleasure is sent in a letter to the narrator, and it's a really powerful moment in the middle of the album. And that doesn't cover all the great lyrics here, but I also really like a lot of what this album is doing sonically. Right on the opening track, we hear a whispered rapping delivery from Tyler, which sounds unlike anything I've heard from him before. And the grand experimental instrumentation of this track really stood out to me as well. And then on the second track, his delivery also sounds very different from what I would have expected, and it's hard to even explain. And throughout the album, there continues to be lots of great production and experimentation, which uses some samples and puts everything together super well. I mean, look at a song like Sticky, where on paper it feels like it shouldn't work at all, and yet it does. I don't even mind the whistling on this track, and whistling is one of my biggest pet peeves in music. Now, with all this being said, there are some minor criticisms I have of the album. While I do really like the lyrics of I Killed You about societal expectations that black people face regarding their hair, the instrumental and rapping on this track does leave something to be desired. And I don't really like Tyler singing in Tomorrow all that much, which just reminds me too much of a bunch of the moments from Igor that I didn't really like. But honestly, I personally think this is Tyler's best album to date, or at least my personal favorite. So, I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. Keep in mind, I have a bit of a weird rating system because I use half points, so it wouldn't quite put it in the absolute top tier of albums I've heard this year, which would be the 9.5 out of 10 category. But while I don't think this is the most consistent album ever, and I'm not sure if there's a song I love as much as Wilshire here, it's still a really great genre-blending album with lots of great storytelling and thoughtful lyrics that's excellently produced as well. I was not expecting to like this as much as I do, but I'm obviously not complaining at all. This is a great record. Well, this kind of came out of nowhere for me. Look, I've heard about Mount Erie and the Microphones a lot, both projects of singer and songwriter Phil Elverum, and I haven't really listened to much of his music, despite him being probably one of the most critically acclaimed artists of all time. And on a bit of a side note, I feel like I've said the words one of the most critically acclaimed a lot in my recent videos. I don't know what it is with that. I feel like I've heard so many albums recently that are getting a ton of critical acclaim, like some of the most of any albums this year, listening to some of the most critically acclaimed artists of all time. I don't know what it is with that. But anyway, the only one of Phil's albums that I'd listened to before this was A Crow Looked at Me, although it's been a while since I heard that album. And yeah, I do remember thinking it was a really good album, but it's also a really tough album to revisit for obvious reasons. And I don't know what it is with super critically acclaimed albums recently, but this album is easily one of the most critically acclaimed of 2024, and probably of this entire decade so far. Seriously, in terms of critically acclaimed albums this year, this seems pretty close to Brat and The New Sound. And this is a very cryptic, intriguing album that's hard to untangle thematically, or at least for a lot of the album it is. Because in certain moments it's a little more straightforward, such as November Rain, where he writes about super rich people owning homes that are empty while many people live without a home at all. But I think when it comes to this kind of record where it feels really mysterious with some vague imagery which leaves you wondering what it's really about, well, sometimes I really like those albums and sometimes I don't. It really depends on how they're done. And in this case, I think the instrumentation is really there to drive forward the feelings that I think a lot of these songs were aiming for. There are moments where it feels like you're watching a storm in the middle of the night and having some sort of huge revelation, even though it's hard to tell what that revelation is, such as in the opening track, which is also the album's title track. And I also like some of the meta-commentary on this album, including in that track and also in the song Writing Poems. And there's a lot of variety on this album, with a track like Swallowed Alive, which says so much with so little words and so few sounds, and I Heard Whales, I think, has a passage that's mostly just the sound of rain, which is really powerful when placed in context. And there's also Brett's, which is one of the more experimental tracks here, some more indie rock leaning songs like Empty Paper Towel Roll and Writing Poems, and of course the 12-minute penultimate track Demolition, most of which feels way more like a poem than a song. And look, I'm not sure this works as well in terms of individual songs, but as a full album, it's a tricky one to explain, but one that's still powerful all the same. I feel like I have a long ways to go before I truly get this album, if that ever happens, but I'm confident calling it great. Maybe not quite as great as most critics seem to think it is, but I'm feeling a light 9 out of 10. Yeah, there are a few moments which feel a little underwhelming, such as The Gleam Part 3, although I may be missing some previous context in Phil's discography with that track. But overall, I was really impressed by the production and songwriting on this 80-minute album, which doesn't really feel like it drags on too long. You know, this sound of, indie folk or whatever that I've been talking about recently with albums like the new albums from Clairo and Lizzie McAlpine and that Soccer Mommy album I reviewed earlier in this video. This to me feels like a much more experimental version of that sound, and one that I personally got a lot more out of. So I absolutely recommend checking this out if you haven't already. This is a great album. This is the debut album by Glorilla, and while she hasn't gotten a ton of critical acclaim so far, she's probably been one of the biggest mainstream breakout stories in the past few years, and Tomorrow 2 is a great song, which made my top 10 favorite hit songs of 2023, so I was pretty curious to hear this new album, even though Tomorrow 2 unfortunately isn't on it. And unfortunately, this was a frustrating album, and I don't mean that it's bad, it's not, but just considering how great Tomorrow 2 was and the fact that Glorilla clearly shows a lot of potential here, it just feels like this should be a lot better than it is. And there are a few reasons for this. One of them being that some of these tracks feel a little underwritten and sometimes a little corny. For example, there's Don't Deserve, where as much as I respect the message about trying to help a friend get out of a toxic relationship, the execution of the track just doesn't work at all for multiple reasons. One being parts of the track feeling a little thrown together, especially in the chorus. But there's also that line about going gay, which, look, there's nothing wrong with experimentation, but that specific wording sort of seems to be playing along with the gay as a choice theory. I mean, this whole conversation is so complicated, but that line does come across as a little tone deaf. But I also don't think the production totally works here. A lot of the synths, which could have contributed to some really strong instrumentals, just don't shine through as much in the production, where the percussion feels emphasized, and it makes a lot of these songs clunkier than they should be. For example, there's Procedure, where the kick sounds overpowering when paired with the high-pitched glossy synths. There's I Ain't Going, which feels like it should be a lot better, but is unfortunately held back by the synths being overly quiet and the percussion not really having much punch, but being quite loud anyway. And I especially want to mention TGIF, which is a complete mess, even if you put aside the fact that it's a Steal Your Man anthem, with the horns basically having no real presence in the mix, and the bass pairing horribly with the percussion. And again, I do think Glorilla shows some potential here, with some great personality in certain moments, such as Hold On, with some memorable lines and a really great delivery, and that final verse in What You Know About Me goes hard AF. Or at least it would if the production didn't sound so clunky, although this is one of the songs where I don't really mind that as much. The one song here that really stood out to me the most was Rain Down on Me, with the grand instrumentation which actually manages to sound gorgeous, and the melodic hook really helped too. And of course, Glorilla herself delivers some nice bars, which aren't the most unique thing ever, but are still exactly what this song needs. I mean, I'm not sure I like it as much as Tomorrow 2, but it's still a pretty great song. And I also really like How I Look with Megan Thee Stallion, which is a total banger where the percussion actually sounds really good in the mix. And look, as far as I can tell, the lyrics here are not super deep or thought-provoking, but there are some funny individual lines, and I think the lyrics are mostly effective for what this is aiming for, with the confidence and no fucks given attitude really shining through with Glorilla's rapping. But unfortunately, I just found this album too inconsistent to call great or even all that good. Especially with the production nitpicks that I have, which I personally think are more than nitpicks. Yeah, I really wanted to like this more, but I have to give this a 6 out of 10. It just didn't really click for me. Alright, thanks for watching. I know those reviews were a little bit rushed. They weren't super in-depth, but I only have so much time. I've got other stuff going on outside of this, as always, so, I just didn't want to spend all my time just completely dedicating my entire life to just reviewing albums. But anyway, thank you for watching. I've got a few videos planned that should hopefully be coming out before too long, but we'll see when that actually happens. Year-end list season's coming up before too long, so it'll be a lot of hard work from me. I do think I may end up not reviewing as many albums over the next couple of months just because of all the lists, but we'll see what happens. I will give you more of an update soon, and yeah, I will see you all later.